Me?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Danny Lozano with the Brunette Edit podcast.
Welcome back to my podcast, the Brunette Edit. So it's been quite some time since I've recorded a podcast, and I am in one of the quietest places you can be, probably to record a podcast. Right now I am in the mountains. It's a little bit difficult for me to record my podcast on sensitive things at home because I don't live by myself. And so when I really want to get into kind of in-depth things, it's hard for me to relay those thoughts when you're not alone. So I rebranded my podcast from Dirty Laundry with Danny. That was a personal choice. I just felt like my creativity was going in a different direction and it was time for a change. I wasn't really focused too much on dating. I really had let go a lot of situationships and just thoughts about men in general. So it wasn't really a place that I wanted to focus my time and energy on. I loved the aesthetic of my podcast, but it wasn't really where I am in life. The Brunette Edit comes from a digital design company that I had, and I took the name from there because I'm no longer doing digital design and marketing. So it just felt right. It fits me. And you can find me on all social platforms. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky Social, and Facebook. I am not on X. I will not be joining X. So don't look for me there. Look for me on Blue Sky Social. But it's been quite some time since I've recorded a podcast. The last podcast I recorded, I can say that it was more of like a verbal diary for me. I don't want to say it was like a podcast that was full of well thought out content. It was just what I was feeling in the moment. And to be quite honest, I don't remember a lot of what I said in that podcast. The whole premise of the Brunette Edit and the rebranding is for me to really be able to talk about what I want to talk about and shift it any direction I really want to be, whether that be dating or personal life or, just life obstacles, social media, news and events, like whatever I really wanted to talk about. And the Brunette Edit makes sense because I am brunette. I like to write. I'm creative. And it just was kind of a play on words for everything I like to do. And that's where we are. So in today's podcast, what I really kind of want to focus on is grief. And I'm sure if you're listening, you think that I mean like grief, loss of a loved one, because I have gone through that. In the last 6 months, as I mentioned in my last podcast, my cousin was unexpectedly taken from us, and it was a lot to deal with. I think from May to Christmas, I was just surviving. Like, I didn't live. Like, I was just kind of going through the motions of survival, and it took about 2 months for us to lay him to rest. So in those 2 months, it was really about just surviving and being there for his sister and my immediate family and kind of just being where people needed me to be. And that's where I kind of shifted my focus because, regardless of what families go through, when your family suffers a loss like that, so tragically and so unexpectedly, you really don't have a choice but to come together. And not that I was experiencing any tension with my cousin or, anything like that. It's just that you have to lay that all aside and just kind of go into survival mode. And my cousin being an influencer, it was a little bit high profile. I did get myself into a little bit of hot water, which I do have to put on record that I'm not sorry for the things that I said in regards to certain people, but I am sorry that maybe it wasn't the time or place to discuss those things. I am a person in my personality of when people that I love are being taken advantage of or they're being hurt or they can't defend themselves, I go into like protective mode. And so that's where those comments were coming from. And if you didn't hear the comments and you don't know what I'm talking about, then don't worry about it. It's really not important. And it's not important to give those people any more attention than they deserve. But kind of circling back on the topic of grief, yes, I've gone through a loss, and it was hard, but it wasn't as hard as it could be. It was my cousin, not my brother, and I don't know what it's like to lose a brother, not in a traditional sense. But I want to talk about grief in more of like a life sense versus like losing somebody physically, what grief looks like from the standpoint of grieving the life that you thought that you were going to have. And I toyed with talking about this because I wasn't sure I wanted to be so raw and unfiltered and vulnerable, but I think it's important to talk about because I know that I'm not the only one struggling with this, and I'm not the only one that experiences these types of feelings and emotions. So I'm in my mid-30s. I'm going to leave it at that. And my life does not look like what I thought it would look like at this point. And it's an emotional thing for me to talk about. I'm going to try not to cry because obviously you can't understand me and I can't articulate my thoughts properly if I'm crying. But I just didn't think my life would end up where it is now. And some of the realizations I've made recently, maybe in the last 4 months, is that I've spent a lot of time going through the motions of life, like existing, but not living. And I'm not really, frankly, sure I even know how to live life. And that sounds so silly, but when you've been in a fog for so long and you've just been going through the motions of like, I get up, I have breakfast, I go to the gym, I work, and you do that day to day to day, that is what your life looks like because you're an autopilot, and then the next thing you know, 10 years have gone by. It doesn't help that I am a hypersensitive person. And I'll get more into that a little bit later in the podcast, but only about 30% of the world's population has the personality trait of hypersensitive. It is a personality trait. It does not put somebody on the autism spectrum. People who are hypersensitive may be neurodivergent, like they can have ADHD, they can have other types of neurodivergent diagnoses, but it doesn't necessarily mean because you're hypersensitive that you are on some type of spectrum or have a diagnosis. For me, I have ADHD. I think I've had it all my life. It is really hard to diagnose in women and girls. I think after I had COVID, it really exacerbated that in my brain and made it a lot harder to function with. And I think now in adulthood is something that I'm like learning to kind of deal with and really advocating for myself that this is something that I have and I have struggled with. So if you have those two things where I'm like already a hypersensitive person, which is somebody who really picks up on emotions and feelings, and the world around them is like amplified times 10 when it comes to like sensory, audible feeling. People can almost kind of liken it to being like very intuitive. And then you add on to being a woman who has an ADHD and neurodivergency. It is a difficult world to navigate a little bit. So when I talk about just existing, it's really easy to do that because I've been in this mode of like, I just have to survive through life. And everything that gets thrown at me in the moment may seem like a drama, and my responsiveness may seem like a drama, especially to people that are around me. But that's really all I know how to do. Especially coming from a really traumatic childhood, there's just layers to kind of who I am as a person. And so now in my 30s, I'm realizing, okay, like my life just did not turn out what I thought it was going to be. And I may have to grieve all of the things that I thought I was going to have and may never have them. And that's the reality of the situation. So when you take it like piece by piece and you unfold some of the layers and you're looking at my life as to what are you talking about? You just are grieving the life that you thought you were going to have. I thought by now I'd have kids. I thought by now I'd be married. I thought that I would be really successful in my career. I thought that I would have a college degree. And there's all these things that I'm feeling like I failed at life. And I think my biggest struggle with that is the loneliness that comes with it. Because there are very few people that understand what it's like to kind of live in that bubble. For years, I feel like I've tried to get people to understand where I'm coming from, but I don't even understand until recently, like, that there are just so many facets to my personality, and like there's just, again, so many layers to who I am as a person now. And so part of that is healing trauma, and I'm actively in that state. And when you're in a state of fight or flight for your whole life, and you finally slow down and you realize I haven't been living, like I've just been doing the bare minimum to survive through life and get from point A to point B, that there hasn't been an opportunity to do the things that I've wanted to do. I've never had an opportunity in the past to really slow down and be like, hey, you need to like reflect and maybe make a conscious choice or do XYZ to get to the goal that you're wanting to get to. To me, it's always been about surviving one trauma after the next trauma after the next trauma. And that's been since as early as I can remember, very young into childhood. So when you're living that way, you don't go through life like a quote unquote normal person, because you're not seeking out those relationships. You're not seeking out those obstacles that are like healthy goals that teenagers have and young adults have, because you're just trying to survive day to day. And so now I've gotten to a place in my life where I'm just like, I have to accept that sometimes I'm the person that people will look at and feel sorry for, because when they go, oh, like you don't have any kids, and they're like, oh, well, you know, I'm sure you will. Or even the response I've gotten from some people is like, well, you better hurry up and get on that, because like you're going to be too old. And, you know, or people, and I know they mean well, but like in relationships, when they're trying to set me up with people, or they're telling me that I need to do XYZ to date somebody, or that I'm too picky, or that I focus too much on one thing, or I end up with toxic men. It's like, I don't need a play-by-play of the relationship mistakes that I've made, because I'm fully aware of the obstacles that I've had in my life. I am very consciously aware of how I got here. It's just hard to grieve the losses from what I've done to myself in life. And I have to take responsibility for it. There's nobody else that I can really blame. But I think it's just, it is grief. It is about grieving who you thought you were going to be and who you may never be. Part of my biggest struggle right now is my intrafamilial relationships. And I'm going to, again, try not to get emotional talking about it, but it is difficult for me. Coming to the realization, without it sounding like I'm blaming, but also trying to hold some accountability, like, okay, you have to heal yourself, that you're an adult, you have to be in a place of healing, you have to recognize how to take those steps to healing. And part of that is recognizing that you got to this point because of things that you went through in life. You can't heal as a person if you don't recognize the past. There's just no way to do that. If you are constantly filtering and blocking out all past experiences and traumas, you will never really heal. All that you're doing is putting blinders on. And some people do that. Some people are able to compartmentalize and just go on with their lives. I can't do that. Me as a person, I'm not able to do that. I really wish that I could. But for me, I have to unpeel the trauma. I have to go in and go back to those memories. And they hurt as much as they did at the time now. So if I'm remembering things that happened as a child and I have to deal with that moment now as an adult, it is still hurting me as an adult. And so there's just a really fine line between accepting responsibility for your own healing and really trying not to blame your parents or people that were supposed to keep you safe or your siblings or whomever it is that you've crossed paths with in life that have brought you to this point. And that's difficult, to reach a point of healing and not also blame people. That's tough because there are times where, especially as a child, you're like, I didn't deserve that. I didn't deserve to go through that. I didn't deserve any of those moments or to be in those situations and to have this trauma that got kind of placed into my lap. But now I have to deal with it and I have to suffer through it. And that's a difficult realization. And so that's kind of where I am. And I've been in therapy for the last 5 months. And the hardest part about therapy is unpacking the trauma for me. And even though I've said it in the past, it is difficult for me because it's a really fine blurred line for me to be like, I'm a survivor, but also do I have a victim mentality? Like, is it both? Can I have both? Can I be one or the other? Because like, I could sit here and say that I'm a victim of childhood abuse. I'm a victim of childhood sexual abuse. I'm a rape victim. But I don't want to dwell in those either. And it makes me uncomfortable when people are like, oh, well, you're strong. Like, you've survived all these things. And it's like, but I've had no choice to survive. That's part of the problem, is I've been in fight or flight my entire life. I've had to survive. The only other option is to die. And I don't want to die. I don't want to take my own life either. So like, I don't have a choice but to survive the things that I've gone through. And I don't want to dwell in this mentality of like, well, like for me, and not to say that women that feel that way or live in this victim mentality, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying for myself, I don't want to get caught up in this poor me mentality because I will live there. I will make my bed and live there. And that will only make things 10 times worse for me. And so the grief that I've experienced in the past couple of months, they've been hard because I've had to take a hard look at my life and say, am I going to allow this to continue? And as I continue into life, how do I stop allowing people in my life that create these traumas? How do I stop allowing people in my life who hurt me and walk all over me and treat me like I'm not worth anything? And that starts within. And I know that starts from within. But it's so complicated and complex because it's like, if you think of it in like an analogy, it's like you're making a cake, right? And you have all these different ingredients and you've mixed them all together and you're ready to put your cake in the oven. And then the directions tell you, okay, now separate everything back to what it was. And that you're going to add this other ingredient into the mix. And then you're going to mix it back all up and then put it in the oven. You can't do that. There's no way to humanly wait or possibly do that. It's just impossible. And so it is very overwhelming to try to figure out how to deal with all the layers of trauma, healing, but also life doesn't stop because you're healing from trauma. It doesn't stop because you're healing from like grief of a loved one. It doesn't stop because you're not talking to your dad or you've gone no contact with your mom. And so it's just a hard and lonely place to be. And I think I find it lonely is because I don't know anybody else who is experiencing it either. And it's hard to convey what you're going through if people, one, are not willing to really understand. Two, everybody has their own lives. We live side by side in our own lives and our own bubbles. life doesn't stop for anybody. So I don't expect people to stop their lives and try to figure out, oh, what's going on with Danny? Like, why is she, like, they don't. But it's also isolating because everybody, again, their lives are moving forward and they're having children and they're getting married and they have these things. And it's not that I'm not happy for people, but in these moments, and especially in the last 6 months, I have found it so difficult to find joy in life moments. And I know it's not pleasant. I know it's not fun to be around. I know that it makes me look like I'm not a nice person, but that is the only way that I can survive in these moments right now. And so when they're inviting me to the baby showers and I don't want to go, and they're inviting me to the weddings and I don't want to go, or somebody asks me on a date and I don't want to go, because it already feels so draining to me and reminds me of like what I don't have. And it's a tough pill to swallow. I know that I'm not the only one. And I know that people will listen to this and say, oh my God, like, you're not the only one. People are worse than you. I can't stand that. I cannot stand that argument. I will never say that to somebody. It is so invalidating to somebody's feelings and situation for you to say, well, you're not the only one. There are people that are worse off than you. You have to liken it to like when we have these fires here in California and people are like, there are people dying in Gaza. Well, do you know that two things can happen at the same time? That two tragedies and awful things can happen in different timelines on the same time, and they're equally bad? And yes, I may be going through something and somebody can be going through something 10 times worse. It doesn't mean that I'm not grateful for the life that I had, but I'm still entitled to feel sadness, and I'm still entitled to feel grief, and I'm still entitled to feel the emotions that I want to feel. And if I have to go back through the past and dig up the layers of the hurt and the pain and the ugliness that I had early on in life, it doesn't mean that I'm dwelling there. It means that I'm doing what I need to move forward. And a lot of people don't understand that. My therapist has made a really good point, is that a lot of people who need therapy don't go to therapy. And usually in a family system, which I struggle with a lot, the people that need therapy are the ones telling the person who really doesn't need therapy to go to therapy, that there's something wrong with them. And for most of my life, I have spent trying to figure out what the fuck is wrong with me. What is wrong with me? Like, there was a point where I was like, am I autistic? Like, am I on the spectrum? Like, is there something wrong with who I am? There wasn't anything wrong with me. Unfortunately, I was born, again, a hypersensitive person in a family unit that doesn't understand my emotional needs, that doesn't understand who I am as a person, that are inherently avoidant, and they've learned that through generational trauma. And I am not that type of person. And so being a part of that family unit has been a huge struggle for me, because we are like night and day. And I don't know where my place is, because I'm not like them. But it's so deep-rooted and so intricate that it makes it complicated to have those relationships. And that has been another struggle of my grief journey, is, do I grieve these relationships with my family and move forward without them? Or do I try to save them? And that's been hard. So over the last 6 months, I've been grieving a lot, definitely crying almost on a daily basis. And I know that I'm not alone. I know that there are other women, even men out there, who may feel the same way. And so for my podcast, I do plan on continuing to talk about my healing journey, things that I've come across. I will talk about being a hypersensitive person and how that impacts my life, and just kind of just unfolding life things that people go through. I think too many people put blinders on to the world around them. And unfortunately for me, being an HSP, I don't have the luxury of wearing blinders. I just cannot. It is, again, part of my personality where I'm not able to put those glasses on and just act like those things around me don't exist. And it is a blessing and a curse, but I think it's important for people to understand somebody like me, because you could have somebody like me in your own life. And hopefully my friends and family, if they do listen to this podcast, they're able to understand me a little bit more of where I'm coming from and get a little bit of more of a peek of kind of what I've been going through, because I'm not the most open person either. I do come across a little bit cold, a little bit heartless. There are times when I'm screaming inside and I don't say anything. There are other times when I'm screaming inside and I'm screaming on the outside. So it's kind of hard to say who I'm going to get, but at the end of the day, I know that I have a good heart. I know I have good intentions. Hopefully, my whole goal for starting this podcast in the beginning was to speak to somebody, maybe somebody who was like me or somebody who's going through something that I've gone through, and hoping that they could relate to it and know that they weren't alone, because I can't tell you how many times I felt so lonely in the world, and that is a hard place to be. So I'm going to try to do my podcast regularly. I'm going to wrap things up right now because I'm sitting in a parking lot in the mountains and it's about to get dark and I want to get down the hill before the sun sets. But make sure to listen to my podcast, subscribe on Spotify. You can follow me on all socials. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky Social. You can find me on Facebook as well, but I don't really like to use Facebook. And if you want to be a guest on my podcast, send me an email. You can email me at thebrunetteedit@outlook.com. And I'll talk to you next time. Thank you.